the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. That's where I'm zooming in from. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to acknowledge also that wherever you are zooming in from today, you're an Indigenous land that was never ceded as well. As always with these Chifley conversations, we encourage you to turn on your video so that we can see as many people as possible. And so we know we're talking to other people and not into a void. And also, please feel free to use the chat function on the side in the Zoom for any comments, questions, discussion that you want to have. And we hope that we'll be able to go to some of the audience for some of the questions. So thank you. And a reminder that we are taping this session as well, and we'll be putting it up on our social media sites in the near future. So as I say, welcome everybody. So we're now 3 months into this coronavirus pandemic, and we're beginning to really see the devastating economic impact that it's having. Now, Scott Morrison has called for an economic recovery to snap back to the way we were. Well, I think that Scott Morrison should snap out of that. Australia's economy was already fragile before we got the bushfires at the start of the year and now the coronavirus pandemic. And surely we as a nation can do a hell of a lot better in our recovery from this economic crisis than going back to the way we were. Surely we can come up with a fairer and better Australia than what we were before this crisis happened. And so that's what we were discussing tonight and what we've called the Road to Recovery section. And I think to help us begin developing our roadmap along that road to recovery, we've got a great panel. We've got Angela Jackson, who's a health economist at Equity Economics and a contributor for The Age. We've got Dr. Andrew Charlton, who's the founder and director of AlphaBeta Australia. Andrew's been doing a lot of excellent data work during this crisis. He's also an advisor to former Labor Prime Ministers. And we're joined by Cherelle Murphy, who's a senior economist at ANZ Banking Group. And we've got Daniel Mulino, the federal member for Fraser, who was formerly Parliamentary Secretary to the Victorian Treasurer. So thank you all. Welcome, glad to be part of the panel. And we'll now kick off. Andrew, I might start with a question to you. You've been doing a whole bunch of tracking of spending patterns and behaviours since this crisis began. What do people's current spending patterns tell us about where we might be on the road to recovery, or if we're anywhere near the road to recovery? And where are we in terms, I guess, of the economic fallout from the lockdowns and the pandemic, sorry?
Thanks, Brett. We've been tracking the spending of Australians during this crisis since it began. Apologies for the what sounds like World War III in the background. If it gets much worse, feel free to pass on to someone else until either my children resolve their conflict or kill each other. Just let me know if it gets unbearable. But I'll persevere until that happens. We have been tracking the crisis using weekly spend data from 1 million Australians over the last 8 weeks. And what we saw at the beginning of the crisis was a really devastating drop in spending. Spending fell from peak to trough by about 20% as a result of Australians feeling very cautious and also being restricted from spending in lots of the categories that we would normally spend. Today, the spending has bounced back. It's bounced back to just under 7% of where it would normally be. And that's been driven really by the government support. What we were able to in our data was to separate the spending of Australians who received government support, either the stimulus, the 6 million Australians who received the stimulus, or the more than 1 million Australians who are receiving the coronavirus supplement. And their spending has been boosted. That spending's been effective. It has supported those people to go out into the shops and spend that additional money on essentials and keep tills turning and people in jobs. If you take out those people out of the sample, then spending's been flatlining. So what looks on the surface like an economy that's recovering is actually a very delicately balanced situation where the government's pumped a lot of money into the economy that's supported the spending of the recipients. And I fear that if that was withdrawn, then the economy would start flatlining again.
So I guess just building on that then, I guess, we're in, I guess, what I've heard Jim Chalmers call the triage economic phase of this pandemic, and that is, government money to keep the economy just bubbling along. So I see this as having three phases, the economic phase. We've got this triage effect, and then we've got what I'd call the recovery phase, which I guess is the next phase. How do we restart economic activity, particularly as lockdowns begin to lift? And then I guess the third phase, I'd say, is what do we do to rebuild the Australian economy? So I guess I'll start with Cherelle. What actions do you think need to be taken sort of now to stimulate the economy in terms of the recovery phase, in terms of now that things are beginning to open up, building on what Andrew said about the fact that we're flatlining? What do we need to do to give it a bit of a kickstart as people start returning to work?
Look, I think the economy, as we've already discussed, is in that fragile stage. So now I think the best thing that the government really could be doing is actually giving people some assurance about how the welfare payments, or the social security payments, the JobKeeper, etc., will end. Because when people feel like it's coming to a very abrupt end, say it's the end of September at this point in time for the JobKeeper, for example, I think that's going to make people nervous. So what we need is a really clear, the government's obviously told us that it will finish on September 30. That doesn't necessarily mean that it will, but I think we just need that path to how we move out of this current phase spelled out in front of us, as well as really good communication from the government in terms of how the stages will evolve in terms of lowering our lockdown. Now, I don't believe that the government's necessarily doing a bad job of that. It's just that they've got to keep that communication up. We've got to give certainty. Confidence is absolutely key as to how we come out of this. We've seen in our ANZ consumer confidence report that we take weekly that over the last 7 weeks, consumer confidence has actually increased after that enormous fall when obviously the extent of the crisis became obvious. So what we'd want to see is that sort of slow step up in confidence continue. And I think that comes with clear communication, very deliberate information sharing from the government to the to all of us really, and they've got to keep that going right through the next 6 months. At the moment, I think that's the most important thing.
Ange, what about you? What do you think the number one thing that you'd like to see done to kickstart this recovery?
Look, I think the most important thing remains managing the health situation. So I think that comes to the confidence. So for me, unless we have the health situation under control, the economy can't recover. It's going to be a very odd recovery, right? It's going to be stepped. So as the economy opens up, you're going to see this pent up demand. You're going to see a lift in retail spending, but it's going to be stop and start. And so really, I think, as Cherelle said, the government's job is to help explain that path to us and help map out where the future lies. Like, what is its plans? At the moment, it's saying no more stimulus. Now that just fills me with horror. Like, as an economist, I think, are you serious, or are you just saying that? I mean, they might be serious, and if they're serious, well, we're in serious trouble. But at the moment, it's all over the place. Like, the childcare subsidy might be ending next month. It might be ending in September. Things are really unclear. So I think what they need to do for consumers is explain, well, this is how we see it going. This is what we're going to do to support each stage to get you back in a job as quickly as possible. Because otherwise, people are going to be sitting on the unemployment, heap for 18 months, 2 years, and the long-term costs of this are going to be absolutely massive. So the government's job is really to explain how it's going to help support the economy on each step of the opening up.
Andrew, have you got a view on that? I won't ask Daniel to give the government a free kick at this stage just yet. What do you think about what Cherelle and Angela have said about this, particularly this government communication bit about what the stages are and where to next?
I completely agree. I think that the challenge this government is going to have is when they get through the current phase where they've been pumping a lot of money into the economy, and they get to the phase after the opening up where we are still stuck in a world where unemployment will still be elevated, debt for lots of parts of the economy will still be high. And then the proposition at the moment is that at that point, when the economy is fragile, then we'll be withdrawing the job seeker, JobKeeper and other payments. And I just wonder whether that's realistic, whether a government, faced with high unemployment, a fragile economy, is going to be in a position, whether they want to or not, to pull back the supports that will make a really material difference to whether or not we progress into a recovery or fall back. I think that's a challenge that at the moment they don't seem to be providing any answers on. I agree with Ange, and I think that one of the reasons they're not providing answers is because they've realised that that's going to be a very tricky tightrope to walk along.
So Daniel, Labor's been very supportive of the measures to date, with sensible suggestions around the side and how to improve, particularly the measures the government's taken, job seeker, job keeper, and many ways actually been ahead of the curve in calling for some of these measures, in calling for measures to protect childcare before the government acted and bring in job keeper. But where do you see, I guess, the longer term rebuilding? What needs to be done? And what would you be pushing for?
Well, look, I think Anthony Albanese set out the challenge really well in his major speech last week, in that what we're facing is obviously a massive challenge right now and over the next few years, but it's also an opportunity to reimagine the economy, just as Australia has faced at other points of crisis. And I guess, without wanting to go into too much of a laborious economic history, I think it's worth noting from a big picture perspective that Australia is one of the very few countries in the world that has been either at or very close to the frontier of the highest living standards in the world for the last 150 years. And you could put on one hand the number of countries that have achieved that. And we've managed to achieve that through a number of major disruptions, including the 1890s depression, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. And so I think it's worth for a moment stepping back and asking, what is it about our economy and our institutions that have been so successful over this very long period? And there's never unanimity amongst economists, but I think they point to, firstly, institutional strengths over that long period of time, and also to our resources, not just our natural resources, but I think other resources such as our building up of human capital. So I just set that as a bit of context to say that I think we need to build on our strengths. We over the long run have been very successful. I would say that we need to, in envisaging our economy moving forward, I think we need to recommit to an open economy. I think we need to recommit to an economy which enjoys high productivity growth. I think we need to recommit to an economy with a strong social safety net. I don't think that the post-COVID world is going to see a major step jump in the size of government as a proportion of GDP, as we saw after the Great Depression, for example. So I think we're going to have to think about ways to make our social safety net spending work better. And then I think there's all sorts of other nation-building policies which we need to think about. So, for example, I think resources have always been a big part of our export base, whether it be wool or wheat or gold or the various resources over the last 50 years post-World War II. I think we need to think about moving up the value chain, as Garneau has put in his recent book, Superpower, and others have argued for this as well, of course. So I think there's ways we can envisage a post-COVID economy which builds on clean energy and moves us up the value chain. And then finally, I think there's going to be a debate about our economic security and our economic resilience. And I think there's a way that we can balance that along with remaining an open economy. And I think, so for example, thinking about can we generate more resilience in certain supply chains like PPE, like medicine? And I think we often think of ourselves as a resources economy, but just a few weeks ago, the largest company on the ASX by market capitalisation was CSL. And we've got incredible strengths in other areas like medical research and development and parts of engineering. And so I think there are ways that we can build on existing advantage and use those as a springboard for high value add sectors in the future as well.
Great, thanks. So building on some of what you've just said, and unpacking a bit, there's a great question in the chat from Fiona Brooks. So Fiona, I might ask you to pose your question to the panel.
Sure, thank you. I'm curious to understand what efforts are being made to stimulate jobs and growth in areas that are actually going to support a thriving future for people and planet, not a return to consumption and jobs for the sake of consumption and jobs, but actually focusing very carefully on what kind of jobs and what kind of essentials we need to be providing.
Ange, do you want to have the first stab at that?
Well, I don't think a lot at the moment. So even looking around the state governments who've announced some sort of stimulus spending in the last sort of few weeks, there isn't a lot of the focus on this sort of Green New Deal, if you like. I don't want to use the Greens language necessarily, but there hasn't been a huge focus on that. And I think that's where you're getting to, that we use this as an opportunity to transform the economy towards more green sources of energy. And then that becomes a source of new jobs as well, and jobs of the future. I'd certainly like to see that. I'd certainly support that. Whether you'd go down the Greens sort of, I think it's $30 billion that they put on the table this week. That's probably going a bit far, but I think definitely looking at part of the stimulus and part of the rebuilding is towards re-gearing the economy towards a low carbon future. And part of that is about, I think part from the Labor perspective is about where we invest. So really looking at the impact of this economic downturn and where that is the greatest, and those areas, those places of disadvantage around Australia, which we haven't necessarily done as much in previous economic downturns. We have much better data now, and they tend to coexist with those areas that need to transform. So those areas that are highly reliant on the carbon-based economy. So really look at generating jobs and recovery in those areas, in those new jobs, so that people can transition out of that high intensity carbon into the green, not New Deal, but the new green economy.
Cherelle?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I'd also just add that, this is an area of the economy that was already going forward really well. So, as we headed into this crisis, we knew that the renewable energy sector was growing of its own volition. It was really gaining some strength, and, companies weren't looking for any sort of government handouts to get themselves going. So, let's keep going with that. I think also, anything, and I agree with Angela, I don't think there really is much being done at this point in time to try and create valuable jobs as such, or highly productive jobs. But I think, there's always room to, to help the economy along in terms of trying to break down any kind of information sharing, if you like. So firms that are doing very well, we need to make sure that those firms are, to some extent, allowing their knowledge to seep through the economy, and creating high value, highly productive businesses right across across the spectrum and across geographies as well. So anything we can do there is good. The other thing I'd add is that, of course, we also need jobs in sectors which are highly labour intensive sectors. So the aged care sector comes to mind. So we need to be promoting jobs in that particular sector. Childcare, obviously, particularly if we keep up some additional government support to that, these are valuable jobs. Agriculture, we know that we are a great source of food, and the world is feeling a little bit insecure about its food sources at the moment. It has been raining too, that helps. So whatever we can do to do better what we already do well is where we should be putting our efforts.
Yeah. So one of the things that Daniel touched on was government and the role of government, particularly the role of governments post-World War II, particularly the Curtin and Chifley governments, where we take our name from. So we're proud of the economic recovery that Chifley and Curtin pioneered. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of, excitement on the part of Social Democrats that this crisis, because there's been such extensive government involvement, presages a new era of social democracy and a new role for government in the economy and pushing things forward. But it seems the current government and their mates in the cheer squad seem to be hell-bent on dragging us back towards policies like IR reform, cutting environmental protections, tax cuts, the same things we've seen over and over again, even though recent new polling shows that majority of Australians believe that the government has a role to play in leading us out of the economy. So I guess, Andrew, I'll start with you. So how do we use this crisis to rebalance the approach of the last 40 years towards a less dog-eat-dog approach to the economy and a more humanist approach to the economy, I guess, a more social democratic approach to the economy?
Yeah, let me just say one thing on the last question as well, very briefly. I think it is astounding that we are allowing our universities to suffer so greatly in this crisis. When if you think about the long term, surely that's an area where we should be investing, not allowing them to just suffer in the way that they are. And secondly, I saw Laurie pitch in with the NBN, and I totally agree. infrastructure, particularly digital infrastructure. You know, if ever there was a crisis that showed the importance of having fantastic digital infrastructure in Australia and doing it well, this is surely it. And, you know, what a time to make sure that the NBN is fit for purpose for the future as it experiences its, you know, many-fold increase in demand over the last few months. Look, in terms of what this means for the future role of the state, I actually think it's quite a hard question. You know, there might be people getting very excited about an expanded role of the state, and you know, there are lots of reasons to be positive about that. But you know, you need to think about the other side of the coin, which is how are we going to pay for that? And it's one thing to expand the role of the state, but you know, we need a fiscal model and a social compact that's going to sustain that expanded role. And that actually involves harder questions than just spending more and racking up more debt. I think those are questions that social democrats need to tackle. You know, if we believe, as I think many of us do, that the trajectory of the last 20 years has taken us in some unfortunate directions, with lots of parts of the economy that have been undervalued, lots of workers who've been left behind, then we do need an economic model. But a crisis economic model is not that model. A crisis economic model of everyone just spending a lot more and incurring a lot of balance sheet impact isn't good enough. So I think it's an opportunity for us to reflect on where we can show real progress, what parts of the economy we can sustainably improve, and what are the new models for funding that that are going to be fit for purpose for the future.
Daniel, what about you? You have a role in a future Labor government, one hopes. You know, what role do you see for the state, and you know, what are the useful interventions the state should make in pushing forward our recovery?
Well, look, I see a very active role, and look, I'd echo the points that Andrew just raised, and I think one of the challenges is going to be that we're going to come out of this crisis with debt probably double and maybe even more than double what it was when we went in. And we shouldn't forget that this coalition government has more than double debt on their own watch. Now, I think obviously increasing debt in this environment is entirely justified, and we would have done the same, if not more. But what it's going to mean is that in a few years' time, when hopefully the economy is back on a more stable path, we're going to have to think about a medium-term plan for how we start to sustainably pay off that debt, and also at the same time think about a way in which government can play a very proactive, creative, positive role in creating a future society that we'd all be proud of. So look, I think one of the challenges is going to be that there are a number of areas where government is doing a very important job, like healthcare, like supporting the incomes of retirees, where we know that through demographic change and other factors such as the changing cost of certain services, there's going to be a lot of pressure on government. So for me, there's a few first order issues that we need to make sure the current government doesn't back out of through a knee-jerk reaction coming out of this. So for example, we've got an agenda going from 9 to 12, and it might need to go further. This is going to be more important than ever in an environment where interest rates might be going into a long period of being very low. And in fact, we can see with their plan to go down the early release path that there's going to be, I think, a real ideological challenge to the role that super is playing in supporting retiree incomes in the future. I think if you look at some of the productivity debates we've had over the last 5 to 10 years, you know, the productivity of the health sector and the education sector, some large and growing parts of our economy and large and growing parts of government expenditure are front and centre. And I think that's going to be at the centre of what a Labor government would have to grapple with. So I think there are some incredible opportunities. You know, there's opportunities for government to invest in all sorts of infrastructure, including social housing, including nation building infrastructure. We can do that, I think, in partnership with our massive national savings in the superannuation sector. but we're going to need to improve, I think, the governance. So there's lots of opportunities, but I think we're going to need to also embrace reforms that help governments achieve all of these objectives in a more effective way.
Great, thanks, Daniel. So, and Daniel mentioned debt there, and you recently were a party to an open letter to the government about debt and warning the government not to snap back to austerity measures as part of paying down debt. Now, Jodie Vicina in the chat has a question about debt, so I might just flick to Jodie.
Thanks, Brett, and good evening to the panel. Great to see you all. So as a question in regards to debt, debt's currently at $642 billion. The government's borrowing at $5 to $10 billion a week. And if we look into the out years on some predictions, debt could be close to $1 trillion, which is unprecedented. So I certainly think the political argument of debt and deficit's not going to be popping up anytime soon. But in regards to the debt level and its sustainability, I'm curious what, starting with you, Angela, you might, your thoughts on that might be. And also, Andrew, your comment about the government pulling back, because, yeah, if you look at consumption, government spending and investment, we know consumption's dead. Investment's not going to snap back anytime soon. So the last recourse for the economy is government spending. But the only way they're going to be able to do that is to borrow. They will continue to. So curious as to thoughts around debt level, where it's going, sustainability, because we also know it's never going to be repaid in our lifetime, but interest rates are low. So they've got that in their favour.
Yeah, so look, I think in terms of where we are at the moment, it's the most important thing is to get the economy growing again. So we're definitely in the recovery stage. And that has to be, you know, economic growth is the quickest way to get the budget back into balance, right? So if you take away the support now, the economy will tank it and revenues will not recover for a very long time. And the UK has seen the instance of that austerity during the last GFC. So the important thing now is to not focus on debt. The important thing now is to focus on supporting the economy and economic growth. When we return to normal economic times, however, we do need to rebalance the books. You know, it's not enough to say just spend, spend, spend. There's one thing to spend for the future, so investing in infrastructure, I think in Australia we could do more of and not see that as part of the sort of current balance sheet. But in terms of, you know, recurrent expenditure, you do need to balance the books. So I think we need to look at this recovery stage, not worry about debt, just worry about supporting the economy and economic growth. The sustainability for Australia, we have very low debt to GDP compared to the rest of the world, where our ability to repay it is not an issue. So that is not something we need to be concerned about. What we need to be concerned about is restoring the economy to health, to getting people back into jobs, and the budget itself will take care of itself effectively. And then the extent to which there needs to be savings after that, you can deal with it when the economy is back in full health.
Cherelle, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I completely agree with Angela there. We can't get the economy back to health without this kind of spending. And it's working. You know, we've seen some data today from the ABS showing that both jobs and wages have picked up over the last 2 weeks. If they hadn't put in place the JobKeeper payment, we could be, guaranteed that that would not have happened. So it's only, this initial stage of emergency spending is absolutely the right way to go. In terms of the longer term, well, I mean, Angie's right as well in the sense that this is a if you ever have to have a financial crisis, it's a good time to have it, given that governments can borrow at about 0.6%, so incredibly sort of cheap financing, and we are still in a pretty good debt position relative to the rest of the world. You know, where I see it in the banking sector, obviously what happens with our credit rating is pretty important, but we're all in this together. You know, the rest of the world is suffering the same kind of problems that we are. So if at worst we got a credit rating downgrade, well, probably so would the rest of the world be too. It's a relative game. As long as we sort of see the currency, keep the currency as low as we possibly can. From that point of view, at least we are in the situation where we are relatively well off. And I just go back to the point though, the counterfactual is that we would have had a much worse, or we will have a much worse unemployment problem, a much slower economy, and that's what we can't afford, and therefore the debt is secondary at this point.
Right, Andrew, your views on the debt point?
Yeah, I agree with both Ange and Cherelle. I mean, I think this is a really important point for us to keep in mind. You know, after the last financial crisis, Australia went through a long period of deficits, and you know, the current government has spent a large part of the last 6 or more years claiming that they've been repaying the excessive expenditure during that last crisis. Now, that is an incorrect link. You know, the real cause of the budget situation that Australia has been in for the last decade wasn't the stimulus spending. It was the damage done to the economy during the financial crisis and the cuts in taxes that occurred, particularly before it. So, you know, I think the key point that we need to learn from that is to make sure that we don't make the same mistake again. We don't allow people to think that the stimulus is ultimately the biggest cost to long-term public financial stability. The biggest cost to long-term financial stability is either allowing businesses to shut down and workers to lose their jobs and therefore to have a massive tax receipt hole, or creating that hole yourself through policy decisions that are unsustainable. And separating out the impact of stimulus from the impact of those other two things, I think, are the crucial lesson from the last crisis.
So James Cockayne in the chat has a great question that I think go to everybody. James.
Yeah, hi, fascinating discussion. Thank you. I guess my question is simply to what extent we in Australia will get to choose our road to recovery, and to what extent it's going to be determined by our major trading partners, or indeed by other major global economic actors who are going to decide whether we snap back to free trade, whether we start onshoring and move to protectionism, or whether we're in an international environment that allows us room to find some kind of new path.
James, do you want to, Daniel, do you want to be the first shot at answering that?
Well, look, I think you're right. There's going to be a degree to which we can choose our future here, and there's going to be limits to that, though. I suppose just looking specifically at this question of onshoring, which is already generating a lot of discussion. Look, my personal take on this is that I think there is a justified appetite in the community and amongst many policymakers to revisit this issue and to explore whether there are areas where we should perhaps look at certain areas of production which perhaps we should bring onshore, even if there are some cost implications. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, one obvious area I think that would be worth looking at would be things like PPE, things like medical equipment, which at certain points in time are absolutely critical. I suppose I'm open to that, and I think the opposition has already flagged that it's open to that. I guess I would just say I would be open to it in the context of us remaining committed to an open economy, remaining committed to trade, because I think ultimately trade is critical for employment and growth, and is also critical to the living standards of people in our society. And in fact, when we move away from trade, I think it's actually those on low incomes that suffer the most, because tariffs end up being most harmful to their purchasing power. So I think that to the extent that we're going to look at this issue, it should be, where possible, building on existing areas of comparative advantage. So that would be my broad take on it. I think that making PPE and medical equipment is one thing. I don't think we're going to be making plasma TVs in Australia anytime soon. And I just think we need to engage in this in a balanced and realistic way.
Yeah, so that's a good point, Daniel. That brings me to, and I'll let the others answer James's question. But it has seemed to me, I mean, one of the best stories I've heard is about this mob in Sydney who used to make staging equipment, theatre productions and big stage productions, big concerts, whatever. They've turned their business into making desks for working at home, wooden desks for working at home, people from staging equipment. And they've actually employed more people now than they had before the pandemic. So that's a nice, innovative thing. We've heard stories about you know, alcohol suppliers turning to making hand sanitizer and other PPE equipment and stuff like that. So, you know, you've said that you'd be fully supportive of us making that sort of equipment going forward as a manufacturing. I mean, what do the rest of the panel think in terms of this? Are we turning the corner and seeing a resumption of manufacturing in Australia, or at least high value innovative manufacturing, or is this just sort of crisis response and we'll go back to the way we were? I might start with you, Andrew, and then Cherelle and Ange.
Yeah, well, I think it is an opportunity to rethink Australia's industrial base, to rethink our diversification both across industries, but also across geographies. We've obviously been very reliant on one sector and one bilateral trading relationship for the last 10 or 15 years, and the crisis is a good opportunity to reflect on that. I think manufacturing is a very important part of the economy, and there's no question that it has very important spillover benefits to the economy in terms of, you know, it's by far the largest sector in terms of businesses' expenditure on R&D. It's a very high-tech sector, and particularly modern manufacturing, and provides great benefits to the broader skills and innovation across the economy. So manufacturing is important, and Australia should have a really strong manufacturing plan. I do think we need to be sober about the job implications of that. Manufacturing ain't what it used to be from a jobs perspective, as they say. It's much more capital and less labour intensive than it had been historically, and I agree with Dan as well. There are particular parts of manufacturing that Australia will do well in, and frankly does do well in, but certainly not all parts. So I think, yeah, this is a good opportunity for us to rethink, you know, how do we diversify our economy both in terms of industries and geographies.
So Cherelle, just on the manufacturing question, but also on James's question, I think about, you know, how much can we lead our own road to recovery and how much are we dependent on others?
Yeah, so I think on the manufacturing question, absolutely all for it, but not if it's we can't do it through tariffs or protectionism. So if we're thinking about sort of artificially propping up our manufacturing sector with measures that sort of take us away from that globalization model, I think that's a big mistake. And I'm sure the others on the panel would agree. I'm not suggesting they're not, but we do have to be just a little bit careful about how we do that. We certainly don't want to bring in costs that impact the rest of the economy. You know, we are a 70% services economy. We sort of shouldn't forget that. And that's where a lot of our great jobs are. And it's where a lot of our, I guess, growth potential is as well. So we shouldn't forget that. It's you know, there's some good stories to come out of that. I think in that sense, this recent crisis has been very good at businesses kind of really thinking very carefully and cleverly about how they do things and just getting on with the change. You know, we've seen this sort of fast forwarding of the digitization of many of our workplaces. Think about, for example, data collection. To some extent, we're disintermediating the government agencies with data collection. You know, Open Table has been a great source of, you know, how do we read, for example, how much activity there is in the economy, what Apple and Google are producing in terms of foot traffic, road traffic, that sort of thing. You know, these are all examples of productivity improvements. I realize not all of them Australian, but certainly productivity improvements that have come out of the current crisis. So I think, you know, to some extent, it's given us a little bit of a fresh look at things, which has been great. In terms of what we can do here at home as opposed to what we're dished up, well, you know, it's a really good question. And as a small open economy, to a large extent, yes, we are very dependent on the rest of the world. And Australian business knows that too. Australian business is very in tune with what's going on with the rest of the world, and their confidence depends on it as well. So to some extent, we just have to take it. But, you know, of course, there are things we can do here. We know that there are productivity improvements that we can make. You know, we've all read the reports that suggest that we can be doing things better through the tax system, through competition reform, you know, through IR reform, dare I say it, at the same time. So there, you know, there are improvements that can be made, and we certainly shouldn't be sitting back and just accepting, you know, what goes on with China's steel sector.
So while we're on this open economy and talking about the international impacts, Michael Cooney in the chat has a question that I'll give to Angela to answer first.
Yeah, g'day everyone. It's a terrific panel. I'm really enjoying it. I'm interested in, I suppose, drawing more on that sector discussion we're just sort of getting towards. And I wonder if there's any work already done or underway, analysis or research about which sectors of our economy are going to jump back quickest, where will employment recover, and where might we expect employment to be really impacted for a long time. It feels like the immediate impact has been on hospitality, obviously, and then a kind of weird half and half story in retail, but presumably construction is next around the corner as under very serious pressure. And I'm thinking not only about the immediate impact of the global disruption, but also a big fall off in immigration to Australia, which might be expected next year, or which is expected next year.
Yeah, so I think you're right. I think there'll be a bounce back in retail and hospitality, but it won't be back to the same level. So you're probably going to see retail transformed, and there may never be the same level of employment in retail as there was previously. And that's a big problem because they're more low-skilled jobs. And so those people might find it harder to shift to new sectors. The other sectors, I think, which you mentioned, construction, that's always weak in an economic downturn. And so you're definitely going to see, a drop off in construction over the short to medium term, especially residential construction. But education, which I think Andrew mentioned before, which I think is actually the key to this recovery, is going to be hit hard. The fall off in international students is already hitting the university sector. And it is an important sector because they're good, high quality jobs, and it's a big earner for Australia. So if you marry these sort of, I guess, where these sectors, there are problems, along with the fact that we're moving to a new economy that's more digitised and more automated, what you see is, I think, education is the sort of key to recovery. Is that, for me, and I haven't got to this before, but I think the stimulus as well as infrastructure spending it's about using this time to upskill and reskill our people. We know that human capital will fall off during an economic downturn. People are out of work. The best place, I think, for the government, and the federal government in particular, to invest is in that education and in select industries. So in a way that perhaps we haven't done before, where we've sort of allowed a demand-driven system, I think I would like to see a more sort of strategic approach, thinking about the skills that we actually need for the future. So whether that's in healthcare, in aged care, and in our digital economy, so that our workforce and our young people in particular have those skills for the new economy that we know is coming. Because a lot of the jobs that were there 3 months ago, they simply won't come back. And we have to be ready for that. And we have to be honest with people that once JobKeeper goes away, those jobs won't be there anymore.
Andrew, you got any views on?
Yeah, I think Ange said it very well. One of the really, surprising things about this shock is that it's such a bolt from the blue. It sort of came from nowhere and is so foreign to us. But paradoxically, from an economic perspective, particularly from the perspective of the long-term effects, it's less of a change in a direction and more of an acceleration of lots of the trends that we've already had. Trends around automation, technology, a big shift online, a big shift away from cash to other payments, much more collaboration. I think a lot of those economic trends that will be persistent are more of a speeding up rather than a change of direction. And I think Ange's conclusion is the sobering one, which is a lot of those trends have the brunt of those trends has been borne by lower income and lower skilled workers. And we fear that the acceleration that this crisis brings about will accentuate that.
So I guess while we're talking about sectors and sectors that might lead us out, there's been a lot of commentary and discussion in the chat about addressing climate change and as part of the economic recovery, and I guess renewables and a whole bunch of areas in that respect. Daniel, you mentioned Ross Garnaut's book earlier. Do we need Australia to actually finally embrace this sort of agenda of tackling climate change as a way of improving our economic position?
Yeah, well, just on the previous question, I totally agree with what Angela and Andrew said. I might just add the NDIS as an example of a potential future employment opportunity if government can get the funding right, and also if we can get the training right so that people can actually be shifted into areas where there's need. So I just wanted to get that in as a little bit of a partisan jab given that I think it's an area where policy is falling down so badly at the minute. But yeah, look, when I read Garneau's book, it actually filled me with a lot of hope. I think it pointed to the fact that at the very least, what we should be doing, I think, is getting some certainty out of policy settings. There's a whole lot of private investment and private expertise that I think is raring to go. There's incredible amounts of technological gain occurring as we speak, but it just seems to me that so much of it is lying idle because we're basically in a policy, we've been in a policy vacuum for so long. There's so much uncertainty. So I think there's incredible opportunities. I will say though that from a political and I guess a social perspective, I think some of the gains that Garneau points to, which I do think we should strive towards, are probably not going to be achievable in the next 1, 2, 3 years. And so we do have this challenge of what do we say to people who are in jobs at risk. And I think, you know, whether it be trade, whether it be, you know, jobs that are at risk because of us embracing clean energy, whatever disruption we might be talking about, I don't think governments have done a particularly good job anywhere over the last few decades at figuring out ways to help people who are disadvantaged, particularly people, for example, in regional communities where there may not be a lot of other opportunities and where they may not want to move. And so for me, one of the big challenges with the climate debate, and this was reflected in the last election and indeed elections before that, is how do we tell a compelling story to those people to get the social license to move forward on this issue.
Does anyone else want to comment on this point? Cherelle?
Yeah, I think the underlying principle is that we have to spend money anyway. The government has to spend money to get us out of this situation anyway. Therefore, we need to be spending it in the areas that are most productive. And it's really hard to argue that renewable energy, for example, is anything but that. So it seems to me to be a bit of a no-brainer, to be honest. I mean, this has absolutely got to be emphasis in the way forward.
I'll add that I think there's a link here to the education and training system. You know, our education and training system is suffering a lot, as we mentioned before, as a result of this crisis, and there's a real need to support that sector. But I wonder whether there's also not a great opportunity to provide that support in a way that enables that sector to pivot towards the skills of the future, and that combination of the pain that sector is in, plus the need to retrain a lot of workers, support a lot of workers that might be made unemployed temporarily or over the longer term as a result of this crisis, that feels like a great opportunity for government investment to go in and make some of the big changes that we've wanted to be making in particularly vocational education, but more broadly, in order to set us up not just so that the sector survives, but so that it delivers the skills change that Australians will need coming out of this crisis.
Ange?
Yeah, look, I agree. And I think this sort of the bridge to the new economy, the bridge, if you like, to the green economy, especially for those areas in Australia that have resisted change. So I think, you know, there are parts of Queensland and parts of Victoria and parts of New South Wales which have consistently voted against change for climate change, which is why we haven't got that change. And is this investment, we're going to have this big government spending to increase aggregate demand, to support the economy, some strategic investments so that those communities can see a transition path to whatever this new economy is that's actually credible rather than just we'll help you transition, I think would be fantastic. Now, whether this government's the government to do it, I would say no. And that's probably the really frustrating thing. You know, a year ago we lost an election, and if the Labor Party hadn't have lost that election, then it would be Bill Shorten and his team who would be in charge at the moment. And you can see using this to really invest in those communities to help that transition forward. We could have seen, you know, amazing changes really in Australia, and that transformation we've all been looking for the last 10 or 15 years. Will Scott Morrison do that? You know, I have my doubts, and I think that's probably going to be maybe another lost opportunity we have in that transition to a green economy. But look, let's see.
Someone just made that exact point in the chat that unfortunately Labor's not in government, and there's not ideologically disposed to do this. But we can have conversations about what we think should happen and what we should fight for, because that's what we do here. So one of the sectors, I guess segments of society most hit by this is women and female. So we got, female jobs. They're dominating industries such as healthcare, education, food retailing, that have actually been the jobs that have been on the front line, as it were, in this crisis. But equally, and I've seen both of you, Cherelle and write about this, and that is that women are the hardest hit by the negative impacts as well, through loss of jobs, because they're often in casualised workforces. So Linda White has a question about the impact on women, and in particular, how we're looking at the recovery through, particularly for women workers.
Thanks, Brett. I know Chifley launched a paper this time last year, I think, or almost this time last year, about the gender pay gap. And I guess the concern that I have is that it's likely to widen if we don't actually look at jobs that we don't have a gendered response to what jobs are meaningful jobs that we want to create in the economy. And if I look at some of the stimulus packages that are being discussed, it's all in jobs that are mostly dominated by men, and it seems to be forgetting that women are half of the economy and half of the workforce, and as Brett has said, have been at the forefront, in fact, of some of the in hospitals, in retail, all of those areas. And so I wondered and I see that if we don't actually address that, that the gender pay gap will in fact get worse. It's not great now, but it could actually get worse. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that as a comment, and what we should be doing to make sure that our response is fair to all sectors of to both genders.
Ange, you want to?
Yeah, definitely. Look, it is certainly true that stimulus spending generally favours male jobs, not female jobs. The fact we're even having this conversation, to be honest with you, is fantastic, because I think previously we don't think about the gendered impact of policies. The economic downturn is hitting women. It's hitting women because it's our jobs that are going. It's hitting us because our caring responsibilities have gone up astronomically, and so we're no longer participating. Now, the future for women, therefore, comes down to, well, how does the government respond and where does it invest? I think we need to be really arguing that the infrastructure spending needs to be on both the sort of the social capital as well as the physical capital, because it's those jobs where women dominate and where women can get back to work quickly. So that is things around education, it's upskilling, it's reskilling, it's jobs in aged care probably, and caring and ENDAS, as already mentioned. So we really need to be having that conversation, and we need to be standing up and demanding that the stimulus spending doesn't just favour one gender over another, because otherwise the potential to put women back, potentially another generation, in terms of reaching pay equity are great. But there are benefits, and I think there are ways that we've transformed the way we're all working. We're working from home. There's greater flexibility that offer the prospect of changing the way we work so that women can make those gains. So I think previously these flexible work arrangements that it's largely been women accessing have put us at a disadvantage in the workplace. Now that they're being normalised, and they're likely to stay this way as people move to more home working, suddenly that opens up possibilities. So it's fundamentally changing the way we work so that it better suits people to balance work and family responsibilities and caring responsibilities more broadly. So there are a lot of negatives. There needs to be a really strong policy intervention, and I think the more women's voices that are out there saying our jobs matter, you must be supporting our jobs, it's really, really important. But then there's also some hope for the future. I think that this could lead to a transformation in the way we work and the way we live that benefits women in the long term.
Thanks. So we are almost up time, but there are a couple of questions, particularly in the chat, that I think that have been a number of themes that I wouldn't mind touching on before we finish up. So the first one is, a number of people mentioned UBI and whether this is now a time to consider UBI. So that's a worthwhile question we should definitely talk about and ask. Cherelle and then Andrew.
As in a uniform income.
Yeah, as a uniform basis.
Yeah, just checking. Look, I think, there's definitely a role, as we've seen with the JobKeeper, to be providing some, safety net. And it has absolutely been crucial through this emergency period. Whether or not you should sustain that into the long term becomes a different question, because we are, unfortunately, after this crisis, going to be starting from behind from a government finances point of view. And, as we've argued, there's no argument that that's the right thing to do in the short term, but I'm not sure that it is long term. What we want to do is we want to get the private sector back to a point where it is sustaining most of the growth in the economy. Even coming into this crisis, it was actually the public sector that was spending more than the private sector and responsible for almost all of the growth in the economy. So we weren't really coming into this from a nice kind of public-private balance. So I'd be reluctant to say that let's put in place a universal income to, to sort of, keep that safety net going forever. There should be a safety net, of course, but whether or not it should be this, this particular safety net, I don't think that's the right approach. We want the private sector to be generating jobs. We want businesses to, regain their animal spirits, to invest, to employ, and to push up wages. We want to be doing things better than the rest of the world, because essentially that's how you get productivity gains. That's how you pay your workers more. And that's really, I think, the end game here.
Right. Andrew, what about you? Daniel, can you unmute him? Sorry. Daniel, start.
Great. Yeah, look, I think one of the things that this crisis has shown and the policy response has shown is a much greater emphasis on not letting people fall through the cracks in this type of crisis in the way that I think they have in crisis before. Not that there aren't a lot of people who will obviously suffer in this crisis, but the scale of programs that we've seen to support people and keep them in work in Australia, in New Zealand, in the UK to some extent, and other countries to different extents, I think has shown some of the power of the idea of UBI, at least. That we do not want to be letting people fall through the cracks, because that is not just bad for them, it's bad for everybody. And I think there are lessons in that for the way that we think about these issues going forward.
Andrew or Daniel Mulino, any views? Daniel?
Oh, look, I think...
You go, Angela.
I was going to say, look, to be honest with you, with the UBI debate, I think there are so many other important areas for public spending and for addressing disadvantage in our community. It's not that I disagree with the UBI, it's just not where I would put my efforts and focus. Certainly the job seeker payment, I think that we're now calling it, needs to be increased and substantially. The idea that we would go back to the $40 a day is horrific, given how that was just putting people in abject poverty in this country, and it was unacceptable. So there's certainly a need to increase that basic level, but I don't think the UBI is necessary. There are more important policies in my mind to tackle disadvantage than that.
Daniel?
Yeah, so I just I just wanted to say from the outset that I believe we should strengthen the social safety net, and just by way of preface, I think we clearly need to increase Newstart, and it would be ridiculous to take Newstart from its current level or job seeker back to its old level, and I'd be surprised even if this government did that. So I think we need to strengthen our social safety net. Having said that, I must say I'm a bit sceptical of UBI. A lot of the rationale for UBI, not the only one, but a lot of the rationale has been that we're moving towards an economy in the medium to long term where automation and other trends are going to mean that more and more is going to be produced, but less and less people will be working. Interestingly, though, I think a lot of evidence shows that there's no particular, as of yet, long-term trend down in the participation rate. And I think, the work of David Orter and others, and even Jeff Borland here in Australia, I think has called into question some of those assertions. So I think that particular rationale for UBI, for mine, is not yet playing out to an extent that we should seriously consider going down that path. And I guess, the other scepticism I have is that one of the strengths of our social safety net here in Australia, I think, is that it has been targeted. And I think that has allowed us to, with precious finite government dollars, get it to those that most need it. And I think that a UBI would be, frankly, very difficult to afford under any realistic revenue base.
Thanks, Daniel. So we touched on before the fact that if we wanted to be depressed, we could be depressed by the fact that the federal government is not of the political persuasion of most people who sign into Chifley Research Centre events, and therefore may not be likely to take up our positive suggestions that we've come through tonight. But I wrote an article last year where I mentioned the fact that as labourists, we need to remember that most of the population of the country is actually ruled by Labor governments. And so there actually are things that we can do for a labourist way. And we do, and a couple of people have pointed this out in the chat, and that is we might not have a federal Labor government, but we do have state Labor government. So what role can state Labor governments play in this recovery and economic rebuild in, I guess, a socially democratic, forward-thinking, progressive way, given we have a retrograde federal government? And Daniel, given you were Parliamentary Secretary to the Victorian Treasurer before you went into federal Parliament, I might start with you. But I thought, you know, state governments do a lot of heavy lifting in economic matters in Australia. What can they do?
Well, look, I'm biased, but I'll try and hold myself back from going into a 60-minute spiel on the Andrews government. But look, I do think the Andrews government is just one example of a number of state governments, as you point out, and a couple of territory governments where a lot is being achieved that is extremely positive. And, you know, you look at the Andrews government in terms of its social and economic agenda, it's building schools at, you know, 5 to 10 times the rate that the previous Baillieu-Napthine government did. And the vast majority of those are in the outer suburbs, you know, where our people are. It's building hospitals at an unprecedented rate. It's fixing level crossings, which are cause congestion and accidents, again, in the outer suburbs. So, you know, it's building schools. It's refurbishing schools in poor regional communities, which don't even necessarily vote Labor, but that have never had a school refurbishment. So, you know, you look right across the spectrum in terms of how much is being invested. You look at social policy in terms of, decriminalising medical marijuana and so many other policies. I just think it's the Andrews government, to me, and I'm sure there are other amazing state governments that I wasn't in and that I should be talking about. But it's a great example of good things that are happening, you know, as we speak. And I just hope that we can replicate it federally soon.
So Andrew, Cherelle, Angela, we do have to finish up, but any comments on that and the role that state governments can play in the recovery, or any last thoughts on the burning thing you'd like to see happen in the short term to help us along?
I'm going to jump in here, Brett. I think state governments have a big role to play in removing barriers to the free movement of people and capital. They can do a lot in that respect. You know, obviously stamp duty is one example of that, but there are others. And I'd really like to see them work cooperatively with their other state counterparts in the Commonwealth to really get on with some of these tax reforms. There really is no better time than now to get it done. So let's see them actually, you know, go forward, be politically brave and get on with it.
Ange?
Look, I think state governments are going to have a huge role to play. I think there might have been a bit of a bargaining going on here where the federal government sort of put its billions of dollars on the table at the beginning, and now the states are expected to do some of this infrastructure spending. So we've already seen social housing is critical. I mean, that is really just getting us up to the level we should have been at anyway, but it's really, really important. Obviously, both short-term in terms of jobs, but also the long-term dividends and the importance to our people that they have secure housing and affordable housing. Then there's education. I think the vet sector, there is a critical role for state governments to play, to be re-engaged, to be really giving direction to the sector, to the skills that are being developed for the jobs for the future. So I think state governments are going to play a big role. And as you said, it's good because there's a lot of state Labor governments. And even I will say, you know, I come from the state of Tasmania originally, you know, they're stepping up to the mark down there. They're spending up biggest infrastructure spending. So The states have done a great job across the board in terms of responding to this health crisis. They've shown leadership where perhaps it was lacking. And I think you will see in the recovery similar leadership. But whether it's enough fiscal firepower is where I am hesitant. I don't think it is. I think you are going to need the federal government to come in. But you know, there will be reform and there will be spending there that is good spending from our perspective, or from a Labor's perspective.
Excellent, thank you. Andrew, you had the first question, so you get the last word as well. Either on this or what's the number one thing, I guess, that you'd like to see on your wish list happen first to kickstart our recovery from here?
Well, just on the state government's point, I'd say the one thing that state governments can do is not cut or freeze the pay of some of the lowest paid workers in our community and some of the workers who have done the most through this crisis. That's probably one place to start, and state governments obviously have a huge role in that.
Yep.
Right.
Agree.
Okay, well, I just want to say thank you, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. We will have a new series of Chifley conversations coming up soon, and we'll put them out, let everybody know. We'll probably take a week or two off, but then we'll be coming back with more and different topics to discuss as we talk about Australia's future and how we create a social democratic society. So thank you all for tuning in, and special thanks to Andrew, Cherelle and Daniel for being part of our panel tonight. Stay safe, everybody, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Yep,
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.